3.5 years in the making, the A7 Mark IV is finally ready for the world. Now, whether you're a Sony fan or not, I think the entire industry can agree on how significant of a camera this is. Compared to its very popular predecessor, the A7 Mark III, I've simmered what's new on the Mark IV down to 12 major upgrades, and we're not just talking about features that were adopted from the higher-end models of the Alpha lineup. There are a number of features that make their debut for the very first time in this entry-level full frame. At the heart of the Mark IV is this brand new 33 megapixel sensor that we're seeing for the very first time. On the Mark III, we had 24 megapixels, so it's a fairly noticeable increment in resolution that thankfully does not come at the expense of low light performance. It's still got the incredible amount of dynamic range that Alpha cameras are famous for, especially if you shoot stills in RAW. The shutter also feels a lot snappier and responsive when you press down on that trigger. Along with its new heart, the Mark IV also gets a bigger brain. It now uses the Bion's XR processor, which is the very same kind you'll find in the A7S III and the flagship A1. Now, usually I don't talk about processors in my camera reviews because it's always a very spec sheet thing, but this one is eons ahead of the processor in the Mark III, so it does actually make a humongous difference in the user experience. You're now getting A1 levels of responsiveness on the Mark IV's user interface. Button presses register immediately, overlays toggle almost instantly, and there's no more of that dreaded input delay when navigating through menus. The official data does say it's 8 times as much processing power, so there's that. You may also have noticed we're on the new menu system now, so big hooray for that. It's visually much easier to navigate through and find that one setting, and it's also touch compatible. Now, there is one key feature that the A7 IV has stolen from the A1, bird eye autofocus. That was a huge selling point for the A1, so as of current, it's a little funny that the only 2 Alpha cameras that have this feature are the flagship and the basic model. Now let's talk about the hardware. What is it like to hold an A7 Mark IV in your hands? It's again a huge improvement over the Mark III, but if it feels a little familiar, that's because it is fundamentally a customized version of the A7S III's body. So the grip, I would say, is exactly the same as the S3, nice and deep compared to the A7 III, with a lot more room for your pinky especially. All the buttons have more travel, and the multi-controller now has a grippier, textured design. The screen is a flip-out screen. The cutout notch is at the bottom right corner, however, so it takes a bit of getting used to if you're coming from an A7S III or an A7C. No more dangly I/O cover flaps, they're now on hinges, and all hail the almighty full-sized HDMI port. Dual card slots. Now, this one's a bit special because both slots are not the same. Slot 2 is an SD card slot compatible with UHS 2. Slot 1 can take an SD card as well as CF Express Type A cards. Now, don't go cramming both cards into the same slot. It's one or the other for slot 1, just like the slots on the S3 and A1. Now, the dials on this have been improved enough to warrant their own major upgrade item number. The mode dial is now split into 2 layers. There's a sub-selector wheel that lets you switch quickly between stills, movie, and S&Q mode. Not only does that free up a lot of clutter on the upper mode dial, you can also, in movie and S&Q mode, change the PASM exposure modes directly from the dial instead of having to do it through the menu. Not to mention, it's so much nicer to jump back and forth between stills and movie mode for the true hybrid shooter. Say if you need to take both photos and video while covering an event or wedding, for example, there is a lock button that you have to press down before the switch can be rotated so you don't bump it off its setting. Another dial that got switched up is the exposure compensation dial. It's been completely repurposed into a secondary rear dial, so you can just keep on spinning it now. You could of course map it back to function as an EV dial if that's something you need, but this is now also the only dial that has a physical lock switch. So you now have a total of 4 dials on the camera body at your disposal. These 2 dials on top are now officially named rear dial left and rear dial right. Now, number 7 is a big one. We get 4K 60p but it comes with a Super 35 crop. Now, I know many users might be disappointed that 4K 60 is cropped, but I'm gonna be the optimist here and say I'm just glad that Sony decided to leave the feature in anyway. It's still a huge improvement over not having 4K 60 entirely. Now, even at a Super 35 crop, you're still looking at a UHD image oversampled from 4.6K. Which means when you shoot full-frame 4K up to 30p, you're looking at UHD oversampled from 7K. No line skipping, no pixel binning. In plain English, that means you get extremely sharp and detailed video. The 4K out of the A7 IV actually looks more detailed than the A7S III's 4K because of that 7K oversampling. Now, rolling shutter compared to its predecessor looks largely similar to me. And to add to the Mark IV's video capabilities, it can now do 10-bit 422 all the way up to 4K 60p. That means a huge deal for shooting in HLG and S-Log. It gives you so much more room to work with in post. The base ISO for S-Log 3 is 800, and you can now force it to go lower than the base ISO when shooting log, which was not possible back on the A7 Mark III. Okay, now here's a huge feature that for the very first time is available on any Sony Alpha camera, and that's animal eye autofocus in video mode. Finally, we've had it and loved it in stills, it's now here for video. If you're like me and record a ton of video of your pets, this is probably one of the best pieces of news about the A7 IV. Bird eye autofocus also works in video mode. Now, I don't personally record a lot of video of birds, but I imagine there is a niche out there who would love this. Now, there is a new feature added called AF Assist. It probably sounds a bit generic and quite confusing without any explanation, but this feature was actually taken from the Cinemaline FX6, so it's for video. If it's turned on, you can operate the manual focus ring on your lens even if it's not set to manual focus, and when you let go, the camera will essentially pick up where you left off by figuring out what was it you were trying to manually focus on. It's like you make a rough focus pull, and the camera uses AF to take you all the way by tracking whichever subject you manually left your focus at. It's one of those features you have to try for yourself hands-on, because if it's done well, it's something you're not supposed to notice from the footage. The 11th feature is very minor but easily one of my favorites. It's another feature that's never been seen before in any Alpha camera, and it's focus breathing compensation. It's basically doing a perfectly timed digital zoom to counteract focus breathing. I am blown away by how perfect the results are. You're looking at results that would otherwise only be possible with some of the most expensive cinema lenses, and I'm really glad how much value is being added through software. Now, the catch is, it's not compatible with every lens. It will work with most G Master lenses and a few G lenses like the 21.8, 12-24, and 24-105. I'm sure Sony will publish an updated list of compatible lenses, so I'll drop a link below if I can find it. Last but not least, the A7 IV can work natively as a USB webcam. No additional software required, you don't need to install Imaging Edge webcam, and you even get options to select which resolution and frame rate you wish to stream over USB. It goes up to 60 FPS in HD and 15 FPS in 4K. Also, while streaming, you can still record internally in camera, but it's just pretty nuts that you can just plug this into your computer and you have a full-frame 4K webcam with eye tracking, autofocus, and all that. Now, that was all the 12 major upgrades, but there's actually a few more features that aren't exactly big enough to be considered major upgrades, but nonetheless are still improvements over its predecessor. So let's breeze through them real quick. There's a new focus map overlay that kind of visualizes what's out of focus in the foreground and background. The Mark IV gets to join the S-Cinetone Club. It now gets PP11. There's a skin softening feature that actually looks pretty decent for what it's worth. It works both in stills and video mode, and in conjunction with the webcam streaming mode. You can assign a custom key that will insert a marker image that looks like this to make it easier to sort through and identify your images in post. The A7 IV now records gyro stabilization metadata for post-stabilization in Catalyst Browse. In addition to JPEG, there is now the option to shoot 10-bit 420 or 422 HEIF stills. Also, the Mark IV now has an MI shoe. So that should hopefully get you up to speed with the all-new, long-awaited A7 Mark IV. The price of this in Malaysia should be in the ballpark of around 11,500 ringgit, which is a bit higher than what its predecessor launched for, but it is more capable. I was informed it would be quite a while before this ships, around late December or early January, so you do have some time to make your mind up. Until then, I will see you in one of my other videos.